So today we're going to discuss some events that I'm sure many of you have heard about before, and we're going to be looking at sort of how do they piece together to bring us about the American Revolution in 1775. So it's important to remember, right, that as the British North American colonies are emerging in the late or in the mid 1700s, right, 1750s and 1760s, there is a growing economic ability within each of these places and growing importance within the empire, right? The products that are being built, bought, sold, and worked on here in British North America are finding their ways into the empire's resource stream and going all over the world, right? They're making British folks very, very rich. So tobacco from Virginia, rum distilled in New England, are finding their ways into British economies and British markets, and they're making everybody involved very wealthy. So as we turn into the early 1760s, right, things are going to start to change. Now, it's just sort of setting another side note here, right? So stretching all the way back to 1688, 1689, one of the things we discussed earlier in the semester was the Glorious Revolution. Now, the long story on the Glorious Revolution is not necessarily needed here, but it is important to know that Parliament makes King William of Orange and Queen Mary the king and queen. And when that happens, one of the things that does occur is a document called the English Bill of Rights is signed. And this gives sort of general rights to every individual in England. Because the British North American colonists, whether they be English, Irish, or Scottish, think that they are entitled to these, right, because they are English, although they are born here in the United States, or what becomes the United States, British North America maybe. They are part of the British Empire, and they are entitled to these rights. So when we get to this sort of road to the revolution, there is a growing change here. So one of the things that happens is that sort of brings against all this is the French and Indian War. So in a global context, the French and Indian War is sometimes called the 7 Years' War. It's a war really between the British and the French for their global empire. There is fighting that goes on in India and other parts of Asia, again, in this global fight for the British and the French empires. There had been a speculation company that had moved out from Virginia and moved northwest into the Ohio territory. And what is really important to know here is that the boundary over the French and the British territory is disputed, and the war starts because of that. The future President George Washington begins firing at Fort Necessity, and this ultimately starts the war. Now, the impact of this, right, is that when the British win, when the English win, the treaty that ends the war, the Treaty of Paris, gives Britain a lot of territory. So basically, the French are kicked out of India, the French are kicked out of Canada and North America, which the rest of North America, what becomes the colonies, right? So so that's why Britain gets control over Canada in this period, and as a result, right, it becomes important for the British now with a larger empire, right? They're going to need more money to defend such a large empire. And then there's fighting with the Native Americans that goes on, something called Pontiac's War in this Ohio region again. And once again, we have more and the need for more and more defense in this period. In order to prevent further boundary issues, the British government passes something called the Proclamation Line of 1763. The proclamation line of 1763 sets a boundary, and that's what this red line here indicates, a boundary across which British citizens cannot move. And again, it helps to ensure that fighting between the British North American colonists and the Native Americans doesn't occur. This roughly conforms to the Appalachian Mountains, and that's what that is for. Now, the British start to try and increase revenue. It's expensive to send and board troops here in the colonies, so they need a way to raise money in order to do that. So for the English, right, their view is that you are benefiting from the defense of the English, so you need to pay for your protection. For the colonists, right, they see it as they are at an economic disadvantage to the mother country, and they should be getting free protection. So there's a series of laws, and these are all laws that I'm sure many of you have heard about when you've talked about this in maybe high school or wherever, right? But so one of the first ones is the Sugar Act, that actually encourages more legal distilling of rum. So it's a way. So they reduce the tax on on molasses from 3 to 6 pence, and the purpose was that they figured if they lowered the price, more people would be encouraged to actually do this legitimately, which is kind of an interesting thing to do. But it's still a tax on a product. The next sort of big law comes in 1765, which is the Stamp Act. Now, this one was a really bad decision by Parliament. So the Stamp Act was that any official documents, legal documents, marriage licenses, playing cards, even newspapers, anything needed to have a stamp on it, and it needed to be paid through a tax agent. Now, this upsets the wrong class of people, right? So the Sugar Act really only affects the distillers, and there's not a lot of them, and they don't really have that much political force. This targets pretty much anybody who needs a marriage certificate, wants a newspaper, any of that, but also really targets the lawyers. Now, the lawyers, and this will be something that we'll see in other revolutions as we come across them, right? The lawyers are always the ones who are going to be involved in revolution. They're the ones who are educated. They're the ones who know the sort of major things that are going on, and they have the ability to fight against these acts and laws. So this is one of the things that galvanizes or brings together a whole bunch of well-educated lawyers, right? John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, and makes them see the beginnings of these major issues. After this, right? After the Stamp Act, there is still major debt for the British, and they are still trying to claw their way out of it. So they passed something called the Townshend duties. Now, these are once again another type of tax passed by the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Charles Townshend, and again, we're talking about really a mercantilistic idea. So basically again, another round of taxes on the goods, on paper, paint, lead, tea, right? Things that you would expect them, again, to annoy this educated class of people, right? Those who can afford to drink tea, those who can afford paper, paint. Obviously, for people who have nice homes, they have painted rooms, and so on. The Boston Massacre, again, another event that I'm sure many of you have heard of before, so as these new taxes are being collected, a group of people meet outside of the tax hall, right? The place where all the money will be collected and counted before it goes to the British, to the government. And as these folks are meeting here, there's more and more people who are showing up. And tensions were already on the rise because a young boy had been killed about a month earlier. So now we are in March of 1770, and these rioters ultimately who are lining up in front of the tax collecting area. Soldiers are called in. Soldiers are staring down average people, and ultimately a shot is fired. 5 colonists lays dead, the first of whom was a guy named Crispus Attucks. Crispus Attucks was the first casualty of the American Revolution, and he was a former slave. 4 others die, and 6 are wounded. Now, the colonists were throwing ice and rocks to try and antagonize these leaders, but ultimately, the punishment fell pretty harshly. It fell harshly on the side of the soldiers, right? So the soldiers are defended by John Adams, the future second president of the United States. So this great engraving here comes out, and it is put on top of an article called "The Boston Massacre." So the sort of wheels of this sort of publicity campaign goes out right away. John Adams defends the soldiers, and he argues that they were in their right. They were being antagonized by this riotous crowd, and no one gets killed. No one hangs for this. 2 guys wound up getting branded, but otherwise, this is a pretty decent affair. So we are moving now into these different events that are going to bring us to the verge of the American Revolution. And the Boston Tea Party now is, again, one of the most famous events, right? So the townshend duties are still in effect, but they ultimately get repealed, and taxes are lowered. But once again, there's a new tax put into place, and people find it to be abhorrent once again. In 1773, the British government passes the Tea Act. Now, the Tea Act is there to help the British East India Company. The British East India Company, in financial distress, needs to make money. So what it does is this gives the British East India Company a monopoly on the trade of tea in the colonies. Now, this is the thing that antagonizes people, right? The tax they understood, but giving the monopoly and limiting free trade, again, in that mercantilistic idea, once again really antagonizes the colonists. So they dress up. So people dress up as Native Americans and wind up throwing, over 100 or nearly 100. Boxes of tea, crates of tea into the Boston Harbor, and it goes down in infamy. The next year, the British Parliament passes the Coercive Acts to again punish the Bostonians, closing Boston Harbor and repealing the Massachusetts Charter, forcing Bostonians to house the soldiers that are there to enforce these laws. All of these things make the Boston folks very upset. And these different laws, these different struggles coalesce the Americans, the British North American colonists, into more alignment with one another. As we are approaching 1775, the the colonists are all going to come to each other's aid. So in 1774, they have the first Continental Congress. As these coercive acts are going into place, as people are upset about what's going on in Boston, people are coming together and they are moving towards an alliance, so that these 12 or 13 different colonies, however many show up to their meetings, are there to support one another and have each other's back. And that's where we start to see the movement towards a Committee of Correspondence, the Sons of Liberty, and so on.